Laudetur Jesus Christus, praise be Jesus Christ. Welcome to Veritatis Vox, a channel devoted to being a voice for the voice of truth, who is our Lord Jesus Christ. My name is Matt Gaspers, and I'm joined today, as you can see, by several friends and colleagues of mine for the latest edition of the Trad Roundtable, a meeting of traditional Catholic minds to discuss issues related to the traditionalist movement. It was launched a little over a year ago, I guess. So what was it, Timothy, like April or May, I think, of last year when we did the first one of these, and we've tried to
Something
do
like that.
several since
Right.
then. So thank you all for being here with me. I'm sure everybody watching is probably familiar with you all, but we have just go around the circle here. We got Timothy Flanders from 1 Peter 5 and also the Meaning of Catholic. Philip Campbell has a pretty well-known blog called Unum Sanctum Catholicum. He also does, you're with Homeschool Connections and Tan Books. You're all over the place. So
Yes, sir.
thank you for being here. The one and only Father Charles Murr. And if he was the Pope, he would be Sixtus the Sixth, right, Father?
Yes, but with a lisp.
Yes, there you go. We have also Nicholas Cavazos, the traditional Thomist. Thank you for being here. Dr. Peter Kwasniewski of Tradition and Sanity, and he's also published all over the place, and I'm sure everybody's familiar. And then lastly, we have Dr. Anthony Stein of Return to Tradition. So thank you, gentlemen, for your time, and I think this is going to be a really good discussion today. Our topic today, as we advertised it, is one that has always been central to the traditionalist movement. What we're going to be discussing today is basically answering the question, as traditional Catholics, how do we deal with Vatican II? Kind of like that penny that just keeps showing up, right? The bad penny. Given that this year marks the 60th anniversary of the Council's conclusion in December of 1965, as well as Pope Leo XIV's call for, quote, complete commitment to Vatican II and the post-conciliar path, as he calls it, I think that revisiting this perennial topic is both timely and urgent, and also the fact that, so-called accepting Vatican II remains the litmus test for gaining and maintaining access in many cases to the traditional Latin Mass, in other words, to diocesan-approved TLMs. But before we launch into our discussion, I just want to provide some brief background and kind of set some general parameters to our discussion. So, since the close of Vatican II in 1965, Catholics who care about preserving orthodoxy and addressing the crisis that has rocked the Church since the Council have generally fallen into one of two groups, typically called, conservatives and traditionalists. So, what are these two groups? Conservatives generally hold that Vatican II was not a cause of the current crisis in the Church. On the contrary, they maintain that the Council was very good. Pope John Paul II, for example, called it a, quote, gift of the Spirit to his Church, and also, quote, the great grace bestowed on the Church in the 20th century. I think he said those things in a year 2000 encyclical of his. The problem, they maintain, is that it has not been properly understood or implemented. And their solution is found in what Pope Benedict XVI famously described as, quote, the hermeneutic of reform, of renewal in the continuity of the one subject church which the Lord has given us. And as you all know, it's typically shortened to simply the hermeneutic of continuity. So that's kind of the conservative camp. Traditionalists, on the other hand, hold that certain novelties, ambiguities, and even errors, although not actual heresies, found in certain Vatican II documents, and which have since been implemented throughout the Church, are a direct cause of the crisis. In other words, the Council itself is the problem, not just its misinterpretation or misapplication or whatever. And there are, of course, differing views within the traditionalist camp regarding how to deal with those novelties, ambiguities, errors, whatever you want to call them, which is precisely why we're having this discussion today. So just as a quick aside before we get into it, for a much deeper treatment of these two camps and their views, I highly recommend this book by Christopher Ferrara and Thomas Woods, the Great Facade, kind of one of the defining works of the traditionalist movement, at least in the English language, in my opinion. So anyway, with all this background in mind, I'm now going to invite my guests to share their views on the council and how we as traditional Catholics should approach it. And I would like to begin with Father Charles Murr, who is the only one, the most senior one among us, with firsthand experience of Catholic life prior to Vatican II, and who witnessed the council's really disastrous aftermath personally. And Father, if I'm correct, you were like 15 years old when the council ended in 1965. So just coming into
That's
your
right. That's right.
coming into your own then. So what
I'll,
was
I'll,
your
I'll
experience?
tell you this. I'll tell you this, just in brief. I think that if you would have asked any Catholic in the 1960s if there was a need for an ecumenical council, most people would have said no. They wouldn't have even understood the question. Unless that meant, and this is how it was presented, we were going to I don't want to use the word convert. We were going to woo the Protestants. We were going. Yes. It was a sort of it was going to be a movement, the spirit to bring the Protestants back into the church. Also with the Orthodox, there was a movement, and therefore it was hopeful. But was there a need? Did anyone feel a need? I can tell you, no, they didn't. No one felt a need. Why do I say that? Because all we were doing was building new schools, new hospitals, new convents, new monasteries, new seminaries, new everything, because we didn't have place for all of the vocations we had, just as far as vocations go. I'm not exaggerating this. I'm not exaggerating it. If you have the stats, you would be surprised. But every place, we were in 3 parishes when I grew up. We moved a lot. And I always remember there was a building fund in every one of the parishes. A building fund. Could you imagine today a building fund? You've got half of the parishes are empty, et cetera, et cetera. However, let me get back to just, was there a need? I don't believe that the average Catholic felt there was a need. I'm speaking about the United States. I'm speaking about Canada. I'm speaking about Latin America also. Not Europe. Europe was a strange place. I went to Europe the first time I was 17 years old, and I remember there was a weight about Europe. There was a negativity about Europe. They were still not completely out of World War II, which devastated every nation in Europe, just devastated them. And I think it also caused a sort of depressive state in a lot of those countries. Mass attendance in many of those countries was way down after the Second World War, and it never really rose again. You had a lot of other problems that we didn't have in the States. We just simply didn't. But as far as the United States and Canada and all of Latin America that I knew, nobody really felt there was a need, a grave need for this council. It was nice. It was nice that there was going to be, and if we could gain all of the Protestants back into the church, and perhaps a handful of Jews and maybe some Muslims, but at least the Orthodox too, that would be wonderful. Something also happened, which is 2 great events: the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council, and Woodstock. 1968. I'm telling you, those 2 things, and they're related. They are interrelated. I really believe that. You could not have had Woodstock without the Second Vatican Council. You couldn't have the Second Vatican Council without Woodstock. They affected each other's existence. And Woodstock was in your face. It was in your face misbehavior. And the church said nothing. Said nothing. It was just kind of quiet, rather than giving an opinion. When I grew up, I promised to end with this. All right. When I grew up, the church had an opinion on everything. I remember just there was some apparatus that came out was on television. I remember hearing people say, "I wonder does the church approve? Does the church approve of that? Does the church approve of this?" That was the question. But when those two things, the 1968 sexual revolution, if you will, more broadly speaking, and the Second Vatican Council, already finished, came about, they caused a real ruckus. And there was no one to say, stop, think before you act. Nothing. It was as if everything went silent, both politically and ecclesiastically. Now I'll stop.
Well, thank you so much, Father. I really appreciate especially the connection between the Cultural Revolution and the Council, which I think Dr. Kwasniewski was going to address at some point today, but maybe we can go to him next. Peter, you've taught the Second Vatican Council at the college level. You're very familiar with all 16 documents. What is your take on this anomaly in the Church's history?
Yes. Well, first of all, I agree with Father Moore that, and this is an opinion that, as you said, the conservatives wouldn't acknowledge. I don't even think they've considered it seriously. But my opinion is that there would have been no cultural revolution as we know it in the late 60s had the Second Vatican Council not happened. In other words, the precondition for 1968 was that council. Why do I think that's the case? I think it's very simple. After World War II, just about the only institution left in the Western world that was a bastion and a symbol of absolute truth and stability, right? That was the Roman Catholic Church. When the Catholic Church got together with all of its bishops, all of its leaders, and essentially put everything on the table for reevaluation, which is how the council was, that was how it was perceived by everybody. Everybody, that the faith is going to be litigated or re-navigated or re-presented for modernity. It sent the signal that everything is up for grabs, that everything is up for reevaluation, right? Even if that was not the intention of any particular bishop who went to the council. And that was, you can see that more concretely with the liturgical revolution that followed the council, namely that as soon as you brought together 300 scholars to form the concilium, the group that wrote the new rite, basically they also said, everything's on the table now. We can reevaluate every prayer, every ritual, every ceremony, every rubric. It's all completely up for grabs. And then at the end, they put something together. They cobbled together something which is a mix of novelties and antiquities. And, it's just a big mishmash. Even it has some traditional elements in it, of course, as well as non-traditional elements. But the point is that the sense of a sacred ritual that is received unchanged as a patrimony was shattered. That was completely shattered. And I think that the council shattered that in a much bigger way about the whole of Catholicism. So that's one point. I think another point I would make is one that Bishop Schneider has made. John the 23rd himself admitted that there wasn't an urgent need for a council in the way that all earlier councils had been needed, right? He said there are no heresies in the church. Everything is serene. I mean, his opening speech is kind of embarrassing to read, Gaudet Mater Ecclesiae from 1962. And, he says we don't need a council to condemn errors, to dogmatize truths that are being disputed by people. No, we just want to get together and present the Catholic faith to modern man. That's all we're doing. So it's a pastoral purpose, a pastoral council. And so Bishop Schneider says, in his opinion, this was one of the greatest exhibitions of clerical triumphalism in the history of the church, because all these bishops were getting together and saying, aren't we cool? Aren't we wonderful? Here's the church, and we're going to present the faith in a new way for modern man. Well, I'm sorry, but if what you're trying to do is respond to the very complicated problems of modernity that go back many centuries, to nominalism, to rationalism, to Jansenism, whatever kinds of errors you want to respond to, bringing over 2,000 bishops together in one place is not the way that you're going to be able to effectively respond to that. It was a kind of it was sort of doomed from the beginning, like a big albatross, like a vehicle too heavy to move. And of course, that opened up a perfect opportunity for the progressives to hijack it and to organize themselves and to manipulate opinion and to get their time bombs planted in the documents. Now, I don't want to say too much because I'm sure everybody has points, to make along these lines, but it seems to me that not only was the council unnecessary, but the very format and purpose of it doomed it to failure. That's the point we make.
Thank you very much, Peter. Timothy, I wanted to go to you next because Father Murr and Dr. Kwasniewski both brought up, I think, the Second World War, and I know that I'm pretty sure your analysis ties into that the council was very much a product of its time, like the post-war period kind of thing. If I'm correct, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think I wrote an article called "The Post-War Council Turns 60," and the term post-war council comes from Kennedy Hall, so credit to him. And as some of you have mentioned, I mean, the pastoral situation dramatically altered after the council. So I think it's possible that Vatican II could have been successful in some ways because of the post-war situation, but that whole situation completely changed within years of the council, and that may have been a cause and effect, as Kwasniewski says, but it's just not applicable in the same way. My view is very much Eastern Catholic-minded, Augustinian-minded. I think Vatican II was generally negative for Western Europe and the Americas. I think it was generally positive for Eastern Europe and Eastern Catholicism, and I think it was a mixed bag for Asia and Africa. I think a main distinction I want to make is the historical meaning of the council and the theological meaning of the council, because the theological meaning is totally abstract and it has a scholastic framework according to the appendix of Lumen Gentium. It's already assumed that everyone knows Latin and they know the norms of theological interpretation. So in the theological abstract, I think Vatican II is not that bad. In fact, it has a lot of good points. But in the historical aspect, there's many, many problems because of the revolution that occurred during the council, particularly when they threw out the schemata. That was one of the critical points of the council, I think. But I would also assert that many of the issues that trads critique about Vatican II are tied very much historically to the spirit of Vatican I. And we wouldn't really have a problem with the Novus Ordo if we didn't have the hyper-papalism that was a result of that whole situation before Vatican II. We have neo-scholastic reductionism, which is reducing the liturgy just merely to the form and matter of the sacrament. There were various precedents for the Novus Ordo, as we all know. So it's not merely Vatican II as a thing that's an issue. There's a symptom problem. I would also say the problems with Dignitatis Humanae. We've got the clericalism of Pius IX. When he actually calls Vatican I, he refuses to bring in the lay people, which is a total innovation for an ecumenical council. And this is the problems of modernity are this complex bag of revolutions every generation. And so there's all these other aspects to issues with Vatican II that go back deeper, I think, into the history. I think there are positive theological things. There are, at least on paper, Lumen Gentium 27 checks a lot of the hyperpapalism. It condemns the idea that the bishop is the vicar of the Roman pontiff, even though after the council, every single bishop seemed to act like that. So they were acting exactly contrary to the letter of Vatican II, at least. But it also, in fact, some of the best texts, I just had hosted a dialogue between John Joy and Ryan Grant about the Novus Ordo, and I think some of the best texts actually we have against just a sort of a hyper-papalist overhaul of the liturgy come from Orientalium Ecclesiarum in Vatican II. They also come from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, stuff that Ratzinger put in there and said that even the supreme authority, the Pope, cannot change the liturgy arbitrarily. So some of our best proof texts, I think, so I'm just saying we don't need, I don't think we should be totally full negative about all the things about Vatican II. I think it is a mixed bag in lots of different ways. So I guess I'll just stop there. Those are some of my comments. Thanks.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. And we'll all have a chance to speak again, of course. It's not like a one and done thing. So I just wanted to give each of you a couple minutes to kind of summarize your views before we get into other topics. I think maybe we can go to Nicholas next. His background is a lot in the Archbishop Lefebvre legacy and Society of St. Pius X. So I think that's where the perspective that he brings to the table. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Yeah, Vatican II has to be looked at not through the prism of a vacuum, but through, I agree with Tim, through the prism of history. And I think that for a lot of us English speakers, the limitation that we have is a lot of the French texts in particular that were being written before, during, and after the council. For instance, there's one
Are you
text,
talking about like the Nouvelle Theology kind of stuff?
both the Nouvelle Theologie, but also in the area of liturgy, the writings of the six Protestants that were involved in the creation of the new rite of Mass. A lot of their works haven't, until very recently, been translated into English. And so, yeah, the position of the Society of St. Pius X is essentially that the Second Vatican Council was what is referred to as the proximate cause for the crisis in the church, meaning that the crisis in the church doesn't just come out of nowhere. It, of course, was building for, even some would argue, centuries beforehand, through the eras of nominalism, Protestantism, of course, liberalism in the context of political science, and then, of course, modernism under Pope St. Pius X, that heresy of all heresies. That culmination you really see boil over in the Second Vatican Council with very, very liberal thinkers and prelates who push forward their ideas. And then the aftermath, of course, is with the formation of the society. The society sees the council as a valid ecumenical council, which is what separates it from, the sedevacantists of the world, but sees it as having both ambiguities as well as positive errors. Typically, the positive errors are summed up in the threefold list of religious liberty, especially in the way that you see that it was after the council, with the removal of Roman Catholicism as the official religion of both Italy and of Spain in particular under Franco. You saw the Vatican had to make new deals in order to accommodate Dignitatis Humanae into the few remaining Catholic governments that there were. So religious liberty has always been very much so something that the society has criticized. I'm sure you guys see it every year somewhere. Some bishop or some diocese is holding a religious freedom day or something like that, and you're just scratching your head saying, how does this line up with the syllabus of errors? I'm very confused here.
Yeah, I remember sorry to interrupt. I just thought we used to have something called the Fortnight for Freedom or something. The USCCB did something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, it's something that's pretty common. Of course, the second error is ecumenism. This is the error that I think on maybe a visible spectrum scandalizes the most people, because we've seen not only the Catholic Church go from a place in which in the 1917 Code of Canon Law and in every single moral theology manual, it would have said something like, praying with heretics. If you don't repent after 6 months, you're considered a heretic and excommunicated. We've moved from that to all religions lead to God, and open dialogue all the time, Anglicans celebrating Mass on Roman altars in Rome and things along this sort. So we see that, but we see that rooted inside of the council. And then the third one, it's probably the most technical, but it's the issue of collegiality. Collegiality, the SSPX, I would argue, in the English districts, don't have the maybe academic level of nuance that I'd like to see put forward, because I've seen good friends like my friend Tim here, who's criticized the society's position on collegiality. And I would tell people to go and read, and you can translate these if you want through AI, but the French texts of the society's criticism on collegiality, which are much more in depth and get into all of the possible good interpretations that could come from it, or the negative interpretations that have more practically come from it. And then finally, to close, when it comes to the Novus Ordo Mass, the Novus Ordo Mass is the practical thing that most Catholics come into on a day-to-day basis. And there is no defense of the new rite of Mass when one actually does a serious investigation into the thinkers that crafted the new Mass. There is no saving it. There is no justification for it. Particularly one text I'd like to recommend to individuals that a lot of people don't know, because it's just recently been translated by Angelus Press. It's called Ecumenism and the Liturgical Reform. This is a book of about maybe 150 so pages that you can buy in tandem with their greatest critique, of the new rite of Mass, which is just called the Problem of Liturgical Reform. And this work goes, I don't even know. There's sometimes like 30 quotations on every single page, which are just going into all of the authors of the new rite of Mass, all of the Protestants they had involved with it, and it's extremely eye-opening. The authors intentionally went and picked apart every single thing that they possibly could think of that, number one, contradicted Protestantism, and number two, contradicted a neo-modernist understanding of the Paschal mystery, which was essentially boiling the sacrifice of Christ down to, rather than in traditional theology, God is offended by sin, we must offer reparation and sacrifice to God, and Christ dies on the cross principally as an act of justice to satisfy the wrath of God. Not that the wrath of God is poured upon him, but that he offers that satisfaction. And he does this out of love of the Father and love of us. That whole notion is completely turned over, and it's now phrased as Christ came to die primarily to show us God's love, and sin is now primarily an offense against man's dignity. Let's be honest, when you hear every single modern papal encyclical talking about sin, it's almost never talking about how this offends the justice of God or we must offer reparation. It's all through the lens of man's dignity, man's dignity, man's dignity. So in practical terms, how do we solve this? I'll be happy to talk with you guys about some of the practicals on this going forward, because I'll end with saying I genuinely do think that the traditional movement honestly is shooting itself in the foot quite a bit more than it wants to admit. And it's not doing a very good job at reaching younger generations in any substantial form, which we'll get into, but that's essentially my position.
Nice. Thank you very much. I did share a link to the book you recommended. I'm pretty sure it is, let me make sure I got it right here. Let's see. Well, at any rate, it's on it's in the live chat for anybody interested in that. What is it called? Ecumenism in liturgical reform and the problem with liturgical reform. So if anybody's interested, Philip, maybe you'd like to give your take next in order, if you would.
Sure. I've just recently been going back to the Principles of Spiritual Discernment by St. Ignatius Loyola. And something that struck me is he has a very well-known maxim, which is that when you're in a period of spiritual desolation, the one thing you don't do is change everything up, change course, decide you're going to rethink all your commitments. And if you apply this to the situation of the council, even though, as Father Moore said, things in the United States were pretty vibrant in the 1950s, there had been a general period of decline in the practice of the faith that had been going on, particularly in Western Europe, really since World War I, but you could say from the time of the French Revolution slowly. And what the fathers did at Vatican II, I think, is basically went against Ignatius's maxim, which is that they said everything's in decline. We're in a period in Western Europe of a kind of spiritual desolation. What should we do? We should rethink everything, kind of open up everything for reconsideration. Whereas in the past, when there's been periods of crisis in the church, you see councils that are called to deal with them, but it's always a recommitment to the foundational principles, always a return ad fontes to kind of go back to the fundamental principles that have been successful in the past. What I would like to see in the assessment of the Second Vatican Council is more of a consideration of the council as a historical event. This is something I've been harping on for years. When you talk particularly to conservative Catholics, they have a tendency to reduce the council to the documents alone, to the text. And I agree with Timothy. Some of the texts are actually good. You know, there's obviously ambiguities in them. There's problematic ones. But I remember when I first read the Catechism when I was a young man, I actually found it I still have it. There's so much underlined, highlighted. There's many beautiful passages in it that are very faith building. But of course, I was reading it with a certain mindset, you know. And then later, as I go through my life as a Catholic, I start to see how progressives take some of these passages. And I say, oh my gosh, that's what they think that meant. Oh, they think Dei Verbum means that only passages in the Bible that pertain to salvation are inspired. Oh, and you start to realize that there's a fundamentally different mindset. And this is why I've always thought that the conservative hyper focus on the documents, it's not realistic. Vatican II is a historical event. It produced documents, but we need to study it in all its complexity. And I think a great resource for this is Roberto de Mattei's Understanding the Second Vatican Council, which really gets into all the complexities of the council as a historical event. I think it was Father Moore that said none of those, or maybe, I can't remember who said it, maybe it was Peter, but none of those bishops who went to the council envisioned or wanted what ended up happening in the aftermath. And I often think, I don't think that any of the various lawyers and representatives who went to the Estates General in 1789 in France went there thinking, I'm going to behead Louis XVI. But the fact is, things like these big complex events like an ecumenical council or the French Revolution, they have all these different facets to them, and the event can take on a momentum of its own that's bigger than and beyond what any of the participants understood. Ratzinger himself pointed this out and criticized it in his famous comments where he said that Vatican II had become a super dogma in the minds of many people that justified every innovation. And I think the conservatives respond by just trying to hold the line on the documents. What I want to see is just kind of an objective historical analysis of the council. And we are thankfully getting to this point now after many years. Matthew Hazel has done some phenomenal work at this, Roberto de Mattei, of course, and a lot of things are coming out now. Nick mentioned like new translations of things that have previously been unavailable. There's lots of things available, like the journals and diaries of people that were involved in the council. So I think going forward, we have to, the wider view of Vatican II, yes. I think what we should focus on is just digging down into the data and the history, because that kind of gets beyond all the interpretations. It gets beyond people having a vested interest in this or that opinion. That's why I appreciate, again, Matthew Hazel's work so much. It's just, what does the data say? And that's where I'm most interested and excited about the future kind of studies of this period.
That's awesome. Thank you. I love your analogy about the from Ignatius's spiritual exercises. That was a great insight.
Thank you.
And last but not least, of course, Dr. Anthony Stein from Return to Tradition. We saved you for the last because you're always such a ray of sunshine for everybody. So
I would be a ray of sunshine if there were more opportunities to be a ray of sunshine. I think that a lot of our focus, broadly speaking, has been on the liturgy, and for good reason. I think that's the point of contact most Catholics have who actually practice the faith with the faith. But the bigger problem that I've come to realize in the last year or so, mostly because of the Synod on Synodality, has been that the ecclesiology of the church was radically changed at the council. And Vatican II didn't come out of nowhere. There were arguments for this being made in a lot of places at a lot of times in the centuries beforehand. You see, the Syllabus of Errors was issued for a reason. 100 years before Vatican II, or pretty close to it. You have not just Pascendi being issued in the first decade of the 20th century and the Oath Against Modernism immediately after, but you had even Pope Gregory XVI writing letters condemning, or writing encyclicals and other public statements condemning what was called essentially just liberalism in the church at the time. And even before him, I've seen documents written by popes in the 18th century. There was something bubbling under the surface, and it had to have come from a lot of the errors, nominalism and others, but also the influence of Protestantism. Not to put the tinfoil hat on here, but the influence of Freemasonry. I'm not talking the conspiratorial Freemasonry, but more of the Freemasons running society, pushing their values on the culture, and that having logically an impact on the church. After all, where do your priests come from? They come from Catholic families who have to live in the cultures and societies they live in. And it's amazing that you have even good priests coming out of the United States, quite frankly, because we are a Protestant Freemasonic culture. We're not a Catholic culture. We are something else entirely. Mm-hmm. And I would love to see more talk of the change in ecclesiology, because I have right here, and somebody brought this up in the chat, and I'm glad they did, but it's from Gaudium et Spes, one of, if not the final document promulgated by Vatican II. Correct me if I'm wrong. The council ended on December 7th, 1965, didn't it? Wasn't it? I mean, that was the last document
Yes.
promulgated.
Yes.
Okay, so I have here, of course, I have it highlighted, and then I can't find it. There it is. This is from like paragraph 42 of Gaudium et Spes, which, by the way, another thing nobody ever brings up is the loss of brevity in documents from the Vatican and from the popes before and after Vatican II, and it gets worse with every passing year, it seems. But see if you can square this statement here from Gaudium et Spes with anything from before Vatican II. Now, some of you are more learned on these things than I am, and I will defer to your judgment on this, but here's what Gaudium et Spes says. Christ, to be sure, gave his church no proper mission in the political, economic, or social order. The purpose which he set before her is a religious one. Now, sure, on a superficial level, that's true. But there is always a social, political, and economic consequence for practicing the faith. And we are told to, with the Great Commission, to baptize all nations and bring them into the church.
Right. And not just individuals. That word nations is very significant.
Especially, actually, if you understand what the word nations meant at the time Christ was using that term. Because it wasn't the post-Westphalian nation state.
And what number from Gaudium et Spes was that quote from, Anthony?
It's 40. It's 42. It's right after the single line paragraph. It's
okay,
right there.
Incidentally, if I just one quick comment, there's a similar statement in number 63 of Gaudium et Spes, which says, man is the source, the center, and the purpose of all economic and social life. Now, again, this is one of those statements where, okay, sure, you could say, well, if man didn't exist at all, then there wouldn't be economic and social life. But is man really the center of that order? It seems like if you were to ask St. Thomas Aquinas, he would say, man in a way is the subject, but God is the center and the source, right? So, I mean, there are things like this throughout Gaudium et Spes. It's the worst. It's the worst.
Right. It's the reason the document is the number one-sided document by Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX as being the most problematic.
There's a very interesting critique of Gaudium et Spes that was made during the discussions of the document at the council, where a certain bishop stood up and made an intervention. He criticized the draft and said it does not relate human fulfillment to Christ in strong enough terms. In other words, the relationship between human fulfillment and Christ was ambiguous. And the bishop who made that intervention was Archbishop Wojtyla, our future John Paul II, critiqued Gaudium et Spes for being ambiguous.
But could you actually make Christ more centered in that document, the way the future Pope said there, while having that jive with the documents on ecumenical relations? Could you do that? I don't think you can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you get that.
I would like to.
You get that document.
Let me just.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, you get that, and then you get this. Somebody else brought up in the live chat also that we see this today. Remember, we're told the Synod on Synodality is about the complete implementation and fulfillment of Vatican II. They're giving us the real Vatican II hasn't been tried yet. And so you get this from like paragraph 9 of the Synod's final document. The local churches are asked to continue their daily journey with a synodal methodology of consultation and discernment, identifying concrete ways and formation pathways to bring about a tangible synodal conversion in the various ecclesial contexts, parishes, institutes of consecrated life, and societies of apostolic life, movements of the faithful, dioceses, episcopal conferences, etc., anything having to do with the church. That's, if you read Gaudium et Spes and then you read that document, it becomes pretty clear that they're talking about a total conversion to a more man-centered focus, a total conversion to that. After all, synodality is about dialogue and accompaniment and listening. It's not about spreading the gospel in the traditional Catholic sense of bringing people into the faith and everything else and abandoning sinful ways of living. Ecclesiology is key to this, and it really needs to be brought back into the discussion. with heavy force. It'll help us understand a lot of things we see today.
Go ahead, Timothy. I think you wanted to interject something there.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you look at Gaudium et Spes 42, the next sentence in that document makes that very conclusion that Dr. Stein is saying is absent. If you look at the footnote, it's quoting Pius XII's address when it says that the church's mission is strictly religious. So I don't find that very problematic in terms of the textual instance. Lumen Gentium also condemns separation of church and state as, quote, that ominous doctrine, and footnotes Immortale Dei. Now, what I'm saying, however, is that after Vatican II, the Vatican pressured Spain to allow more religious liberty. So even if, we can put our PhD and go to our ivory tower and we can make sense of the doctrine and it's orthodox, but the actual outplay, the application thereof, then we have a problem here, because then we have the Vatican sort of imposing a separation of church and state American style on places like Spain, that's a huge problem.
I'm sure Father Murr would agree with that, residing in Spain, right, Father?
Well, absolutely.
One thing I wanted to bring up before we get into some other topics, a couple of people have brought it up, the crisis of modernism in the, really beginning in the late 1800s or early 1900s. That really is critical to understanding the current crisis in the church. And a great resource for getting into that, a deep dive into it, is our friend Kennedy Hall's new book, What Happened to Catholicism? And I think the original working title of this book actually was Modernism is a Sin, kind of a play on that book from Angelus Press, Liberalism is a Sin. Kennedy was not able to join us today. Please do keep him in your prayers. His family is going through a very difficult trial right now with a kind of a crisis pregnancy situation. Their unborn son has a very serious congenital heart disease. So if you would, please keep all of them in your prayers. And yes. So anyway, before so kind of getting into another topic that I definitely wanted to hit on today, the subtitle to today's podcast is How Do We Deal with Vatican II? And I want to bring back to people's minds, a few years ago, two great prelates of our times, Bishop Athanasius Schneider and Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, had a very interesting public exchange of statements. And this was in the summer of 2020, kind of at the height of all the COVID insanity. And they started writing about Vatican II. And I have a couple of slides here, some kind of the main quotes from their statements. So Bishop Schneider, as I recall, originally released a text in either late May or early June of 2020, focusing specifically on Dignitatis Humanae, the Vatican II document on religious liberty. And then Vigano responded to that, and they kind of had a brief, back and forth exchanging ideas. So this is from June 24th of 2020, a text called 55 Years Later, Bishop Athanasius Schneider's Appraisal of Vatican II, available on the Remnants website. And this is what he said. Ultimately, the papal magisterium has to clarify in a convincing manner the controversial points of some of the expressions in the council texts. Until now, this has not always been done in an intellectually honest and convincing way. Were it necessary, he says, a pope or future ecumenical council would have to add explanations, a kind of notae explicavitae posteriors, like notes after the fact, or even amendments and corrections of those controversial expressions, since they were not presented by the council as an infallible and definitive teaching. So as in regard to the question, how do we deal with the council? This is kind of one option, the Schneider option, which is kind of like line item veto, as Dr. Taylor Marshall has called it in the past. Archbishop Vigano, on the other hand, takes a different approach and basically thinks we just need to trash the entire council. So this is what Archbishop Vigano says. Regarding the possibility of making a correction to the acts of the Second Vatican Council, I think that we can agree the heretical propositions or those which favor heresy should be condemned. And I just, as an aside, I don't think all trads think that there are actual like formal official heresies in the text of the council. That's Archbishop Vigano's opinion, but I don't think everyone shares that opinion. And he said, we can only hope that this will happen as soon as possible. My objection to Bishop Schneider stems rather from my concern about the possibility that there will be preserved among the official acts of the church a hapax, kind of like a unique anomaly, that beyond ambiguous formulations of discontinuity was intended and conceived for its subversive value, the revolution that went on during the council, the battle between the modernists and the conservatives, traditionalists, and which has caused many evils. From a legal point of view, Vigano says the most suitable solution may be found in making corrections, like Schneider suggests, but from the pastoral point of view, that is, as regards the council's usefulness for the edification of the faithful, it is preferable to let the whole thing drop and be forgotten. And he also says it should also be remembered that the event of the council far surpasses the documents which it produced. So I'd be curious to know where you all stand on those two options. They're not the only options, but I think significant ones, if anybody wants to take a crack at it.
Well, I just will say that Archbishop Vigano's idea, there's no way that's going to happen. Like, there's not going to be some based pope in the future that just repudiates an entire ecumenical council. It's just not going to happen. I do think there's merit to what Athanasius Schneider says. In fact, some of you might remember this has already happened. In 2007, the CDF issued a clarification on some items from Lumen Gentium on the phrase subsistit in, clarifying that basically this phrase that the Catholic Church, or the church subsists in the Catholic Church, is to be understood as unique to the Catholic Church alone. So this, now to my knowledge, that's the only time that there's been a clarification of specific ambiguous phrases in Vatican II. So that's already been attempted under the pontificate of Cardinal Ratzinger. I'm not sure that would correct everything by any means, because as Vigano pointed out, the council as an event is bigger than the documents. So, I mean, obviously just fixing the documents isn't going to fix everything. I mean, the documents say we're supposed to have Gregorian chant, but you can do that kind of line item approach for sure.
So I just want to pick up on something you're saying, Philip. You said you were talking earlier about the council as an event has massively overshadowed its documents and outstripped them, right? And the conservatives accused traditionalists of being at one with the progressives and the liberals in the church by holding that the event should be taken seriously, the consequences of the event, more than just this laser focus on the documents. But I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right in terms of what the council means. And here's the big point for me. I think that Vatican II, as a documentary, as a set of documents, means less and less, has meant less and less for a very long time. As a symbol, it means everything, right? It is used as an ensign around which people can gather of a certain mentality. Traditionalists and conservatives never really, very rarely do they want to use Vatican II as their main rallying call, because they recognize that it's rather weak. It's like the trumpet, the uncertain trumpet that St. Paul talks about, right? So a conservative at best will use Vatican II as window dressing along with other solid sources. Often post-Vatican II documents are much clearer than Vatican II ever was. John Paul II at his best, Benedict XVI at his best are much clearer than Vatican II. And these are the sort of people that, Bishop Barron, I think, looks to more fundamentally than to Vatican II. It's always Vatican II through the lens of these popes. Mm-hmm. And so my point is that ultimately Vatican II represents something. And all that's really needed, I think sometimes people get too legalistic and they say, oh, a future pope needs to create a new syllabus of errors. This is something Bishop Schneider suggested all the way back in 2010. A future syllabus of errors with all of the errors, erroneous or ambiguous or novel propositions of Vatican II, not even necessarily attributed to Vatican II, but just to be listed and then corrected in the various ways they need to be corrected. Well, I would love that. I would rejoice if that happened. I'm sure it would be helpful. But this is a very intellectualist and legalist way of thinking. What we need is a future pope who doesn't care about Vatican II, who doesn't make it the symbol, the be-all and end-all of everything Catholicism is called to be in the modern world. If we had a pope, honestly, if we had a pope who celebrated the traditional Latin Mass in St. Peter's, that would mean more than a syllabus of errors about Vatican II. If we had a future pope who reinstated the traditional Mass, even as a rite alongside the new rite, the way the Anglicans have, different rites or whatever, something like that is going to be much more efficacious in overcoming the false ideas and the false mentality that this council ushered in or allowed to flourish. And so in terms of like a long-term healing and a long-term strategy, it seems to me much more important for a future pope to stop treating Vatican II as the be-all and end-all of modern Catholicism, and that's my.
And just to tie into that, I prepared that this is a very interesting take from Dr. Taylor Marshall regarding what you just said, Peter. That basically he says less than 1% of Catholics have read the documents of Vatican II, which is probably true. 99% of Catholics have experienced the new liturgies since Vatican II. The average Catholic's experience of the new liturgies since Vatican II has had a much wider and deeper impact than the V2 documents that are now considered artifacts 60 years later. The fact is this: the role of the traditional Latin Mass is still one of the most contested controversies in Catholicism after 60 years. It is not going away. It is still growing among the young people. Most people under 35 want the Latin Mass. Vatican II is not on their radar. So maybe that's a good segue into the liturgical aspect. Also, I know we want to get to Nick's take on why we're failing, the traditionalist movement is failing to reach Gen Z. But I wanted to come back real quick to something that Dr. Stein was talking about, the ecclesiology, because I agree that is central to this whole discussion. And Pope Francis himself actually made that quite clear about a year after he issued Traditionis Custodes. And I have a quote from the document. So as you'll recall, in June of 2022, he issued what I consider to be like his apologia for Traditionis Custodes, his defense of that action. And he said in that document, it would be trivial to read the tensions unfortunately present around the celebration, the fight, the liturgical wars, basically, as a simple divergence between different tastes concerning a particular ritual form. The problematic is primarily ecclesiological. In other words, it goes to the very heart of the nature of the church. That's what ecclesiology deals with. I do not see how, he says, it is possible to say that one recognizes the validity of the council and at the same time not accept the liturgical reform born out of Sacrosanctum Concilium, a document that expresses the reality of the liturgy intimately joined to the vision of church. He didn't say the church, he just said church, strangely. So admirably described in Lumen Gentium, which is the dogmatic constitution on the church. For this reason, he says, as I already expressed in my letter to all the bishops, I have felt it my duty to affirm that, and then the horrible line from TC, the liturgical books promulgated by Paul VI and JP2 in conformity with the decrees of Vatican II are the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite, which is just laughable. So, but it definitely does. I mean, what he's saying is that, as I understand it anyway, the tensions which exist between Catholics who embrace the quote unquote liturgical reform and those who resist it are based not on different tastes, but on divergent ecclesiologies. That is, on fundamentally different doctrinal positions about the church's very nature. And Cardinal Roach and Cardinal Supich, we might have time to get to Cardinal Supich's latest rant at the end, but they've said the same thing. Ultimately, this is about the vision of the church. In other words, the traditional Latin Mass in their minds is incompatible with the Second Vatican Council. What do you all think about that notion?
Poppycock.
Father, I was just going to, as a priest, Father, what do you think of that?
Poppycock. That's what I think of that.
Agreed.
Yes. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Ridiculous. Can I just say one thing quickly? Let me just say
Sure.
one thing quickly about what we were talking about just a few minutes ago. Vigano and Schneider, right?
Yes.
You just cannot say that an ecumenical council should be thrown out. This is impossible. It's simply impossible. What you can do is set up a series of synods, real synods, to look into the questions, the ambiguities that are there, and correct them. That can be done. But to take Vigano's, I love Vigano and I respect him on many issues. But to come to the point of saying that just chuck the entire council, you can't do that. You would cause such a division in Christianity that you wouldn't believe it. That can't be done. So we have to. This is the reality. We have to work with it. We have to correct it. And there's an awful lot to correct, but it can be done.
Mm-hmm. Regarding this claim from Pope Francis, I agree with Father. It's baloney. He said poppycock. I'll say baloney. The reason it's baloney is, first of all, no serious scholar thinks anymore that the liturgical reform that came after Vatican II is directly a logical consequence of what Sacrosanctum Concilium says. It is it's a barely possible implementation of Sacrosanctum Concilium, although it also contradicts a number of things in that document. But in terms of, we're talking earlier about how new memoirs, new information is always coming out. I held this up. This is Archimandrite Boniface Loix's memoir, A Wider View of Vatican II, which he wrote in the late 90s. It was lost and rediscovered and just published a few weeks ago by Angelico Press. I've been talking about this at my Substack if you're interested, but Boniface Loix was involved in everything. He was at all 4 sessions of the council. He helped write Sacrosanctum Concilium. He was on the concilium with Bugnini. He knows everybody. He knows everything that goes on. And he is one of the most savage critics of the Novus Ordo you will ever read. Right. And he says he thinks it completely betrayed the liturgical movement and all of the best impulses that went into Sacrosanctum Concilium. Now, I'm not a big fan of Sacrosanctum Concilium, but I agree with him fundamentally. So first of all, this is the most basic problem with what Francis is claiming, that the Novus Ordo equals Vatican II. That's just false. And the second problem is, any aspect that you want to focus in on and call it Vatican II ecclesiology, the people are more actively involved in the liturgy. A traditionalist can just flip that around and say, no, actually, they are more involved in a more profound and essential way in the traditional mass than they ever are in the Novus Ordo. And you can, every claim about this is a new feature we have that is so wonderful, you can just find the equivalent of it even better in the liturgical tradition. So I just think the whole thing that Francis says there is a house of cards, and you can just knock it over.
In regards to ecclesiology, I think that Vatican II does bring in, from an Eastern Catholic perspective, it brings in more of Eucharistic ecclesiology from the patristics, which is going back to a more traditional view of the local bishop as the presider of the Eucharist, which is the church. But at the same time, if anyone says that the Latin Mass does not express the ecclesiology of Vatican II, all of the bishops at Vatican II were celebrating the Latin Mass during the whole council. And if you have this revolutionary mindset, then the entire council itself is undermined too, because the entire council itself rests on tradition as its authoritative principle. And so you're just undermining the entire Vatican II, because we can just dissent, like Pope Francis, at least prima facie, is saying that we can then dissent from what came before. Well, then why can't we just dissent from Vatican II and go to the next step? And so it's just a revolutionary presupposition.
But go ahead, Philip, go ahead.
Oh, just real briefly, it should also be pointed out with Francis's comment that when these sorts of comments are made, there's always an equivocation on the word accept. When he says, how can you not accept the Novus Ordo?
Good point.
Many traditionalists, I don't want to speak for everyone, but the most traditionalists I know, we accept the Novus Ordo as an actual liturgy that's validly promulgated. That doesn't mean we like it or think that it's as good as the traditional Latin Mass, but you'll always find that they have to go to an equivocation on what it means to accept or embrace something.
So, Dr. Stein, what's your take on what Pope Francis said? Because I know you were emphasizing the importance of ecclesiology earlier. I'm curious to know what you think about that quote.
I mean, blaming or crediting Sacrosanctum Concilium with the new Mass is laughable. If you read the document, you don't have essentially annihilation of the existing rite of Mass and a new rite of Mass being promulgated by it. And as for the option between Schneider and Vigano, I don't think a few line item vetoes of the document is going to work, but neither is Vigano's, because this side of the, more apocalyptic interpretations of Fatima, you're not going to have something like that happening where you will have an entire council thrown out without causing chaos, as was described earlier by another panel member.
Mm-hmm.
But the line item veto option doesn't get to one of the problems, which is there was a spirit of revolution at the council. We saw this with the cutting of the microphone of Cardinal Ottaviani at the council. You had Paridi, who were suspect of heresy, participating at the council. You had the the 9 schemata or whatever it was that were prepared by John the 23rd and Cardinal Ottaviani with an expectation of a 6-week council. All of them except for Sacrosanctum Concilium basically tossed out. There was a revolutionary spirit there. We now call that spirit the spirit of Vatican II. And I don't have a solution for the spirit of Vatican II other than to keep the faith, learn the faith, and have a lot of kids and hope that enough of your sons become priests that we can just purge the spirit of Vatican II through just the attrition of demographics.
Yep.
That might be the best hope, if short of the more apocalyptic interpretations of Fatima coming to pass, which I would rather not have. I'd rather not live through that. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that might be a good segue to Nicholas, his take on, because you're a member of Gen Z, is that correct? I think you're the youngest among us. So you have, your theory is that the traditionalist movement is failing in large part to reach Gen Z, and those are people ages like 13 to 20 something, I forget exactly, but
yeah, I think it's like 13 to 28, I think.
Okay. Which I find that interesting because, I mean, it's from my perspective. I'm 40. I turned 40 last October, and it seems like the traditional Mass is large. It's attracting young people. The sharp pilgrimage is growing exponentially each year. So how do you think that we're failing to reach the younger generation?
Sure. Yeah. So when it comes to just the questions that were previously posed about Vigano versus Schneider, spicy take, but I'm young, so I guess I can make spicy takes and people can understand because I live online. But I genuinely think that not only is Vigano's position on Vatican II just it's so unrealistic because it's never going to happen. And I agree with Father. I think that it would be disastrous for the church to just be like, hey, psych, we're just not going to do this thing anymore. And that's why a lot of the theories of the sedes continue to unimpress me and remind me very much so of King James onlyism in the Protestant world, where the Jesuits are behind everything instead of the Jews, and tinfoil hats galore, etc. Vigano, I do think, actually leads into this question, though, that you're asking me. Vigano, I think, unfortunately, is a dead albatross on the traditional movement. He's a dead albatross that's pulling it down. And what I mean by that is this. The Gen Zers, you see this in Taylor Marshall's quote. Gen Z loves reverent liturgy. It loves reverent liturgy. It's not going to be impressed by going into a church with, corny felt banners and guitar music and stuff like that, right? We're seeing this massive conversion of a lot of Gen Zers from leftist culture here in the United States, a lot of them from my background, non-denominationalism, so they're not impressed with the rock concerts. They want serious religion. But here's the thing. Their traditionalism is only as deep as aesthetics. They like the pretty liturgy, whether the pretty liturgy be at the TLM or the Anglican Ordinariate or Latin New Mass or what have you, Eastern liturgies, etc. That's as much as it goes. And for them, they're not educated in the let's just say, the arguments of traditionalism, because a lot of traditionalist influencers or content creators, whatever term you guys want to use for yourselves, you're not reaching them. And the reason that we're not reaching them is that we're not on the platforms that they're on. So all of us are on YouTube. Clearly, we're on YouTube right now. But I don't think any of you guys are probably on like Instagram or TikTok making reels and even short 60-second clips of ideas and throwing them out there to Gen Z. And this is what I mean by this. Gen Z, it is wanting something. It wants and desires tradition as they see it, but they don't know the traditionalist arguments. And part of it's because we're not on their platforms, except for myself. But then another part of it is the way that we present ourselves. And this is something that, Tim and I have talked about before on the Meaning of Catholic, is that traditionalists oftentimes present themselves as the absolute doomers of society, and no one wants to hang around a bunch of doomers. And I'll be honest with you guys, if any of you guys are on Twitter, you would have seen this last year. Yeah, Anthony Abate, he's reaching Gen Z because he's on Twitter and he can laugh, and that's a thing that Gen Z likes to laugh. But if you guys remember, last year, year before, there was this whole, like, if you will, like flurry on Twitter where everybody was running around saying Pope Francis was the most base pope ever, right?
Yeah, like that Pope Respecter, whoever does that account, that was their big thing.
Exactly. Yeah. The reason that they were doing that was, on the one hand, there was a handful of people that actually believed that, but a lot of it was reaction to what they saw as is boomer trads who were just complaining about every single thing in society and saying everything was Pope Francis's fault. And so they decided, let's just troll them and let's go to the opposite respect. And so that's why a lot of Gen Zers actually, in kind of, if you will, happenstance, are actually fairly hyper-papalist now. And it doesn't make any sense on an intellectual level, because it's like you have a lot of these guys who are like, the Nick Fuentes, America First guys who are like, we want a white nationalist nation, but Vatican II is based, and we must somehow make this continuity between Mein Kampf and Dignitatis Humanae, right? Like this is the mentality of a lot of Gen Zers right now. But it's because a lot of us, when we're talking about stuff, we're not on their platforms and we're only doom pilling all the time. So what is the solution then, if you will, to moving forward? On the sense of getting young people, you guys have to just stop writing endless articles about cool customs that took place 14 centuries ago, because Gen Z's not going to be reading stuff, right? So way less.
Oh, I'm called out.
Yeah, way less writing about stuff that no one knows about, and way more getting on Instagram and making videos being like, showing the beauty of that stuff, right? Showing the beauty of that stuff, or getting on, another social media platform and trying to engage with young people and saying, you guys know where all of this insane like dating culture and this like leftist sewage culture around marriage comes from? It comes from modernism. Let me tell you in 60 seconds. Things like that can really go a long way. And then finally, when it comes to this overarching question that we've asked of how do we deal with Vatican II, right? It's the title of this episode. It actually uniquely lines in with your question about Gen Z. And this is where I'll finish. Yesterday, I made an episode talking about the horrible and sacrilegious parade. It was a pride parade, essentially, into the Vatican of over 1,400 homosexuals. Like, would that have happened under the era of Pope St. Pius X? It definitely would have not have happened. But what I have asked my audience over the last like 4 or 5 episodes is this: should I launch a Catholic Reconquista? Now, real quick, show of hands. How many of you guys know who Redeemed Zoomer is? Raise your hands.
I've heard of him. I don't know much about him.
Vaguely familiar.
Yeah, some of you guys are vaguely familiar. Okay. He has like 200,000 followers on Twitter alone, several 100,000 followers on YouTube. And you know what he does? He makes Minecraft videos and talks about theology. But he's winning because he's getting tons and tons of people interested in Presbyterianism, of all things.
He's
right?
also not attacking the hobbies of Gen Z, which blows my mind whenever I see some traditional Catholic go on and say, you like video games, you're going to hell.
No, exactly.
It's like you're wanting to lose an entire multiple generations of people doing that.
Nick, would you say that Mass of the Ages is reaching Gen Z?
Mass of the Ages was a good first step, but I would say, honestly, Mass of the Ages, where it lacks still, is that, again, it gives this portrayal that the TLM and fighting for the TLM is just about the aesthetics, we love this venerable tradition, let us have this, without actually pushing forward the historical traditionalist critique, which you see a little bit in episode 2, which was this thing is really influenced by not only bad actors but by bad theology. That being said, my point was this: I asked my audience, do you guys want me to do a Catholic Reconquista? Because this Redeemed Zoomer guy, he's doing it for the Protestant denominations.
Mm-hmm.
I had over 500 people in one episode, 500 young guys who were like, please, we need to get on this and do this. And we've started this Discord server. And the first thing that we're talking about is the following. We're going to approach individuals like Cardinal Burke, who have put out, Tim, you know the name of it, but it's like the Declaration of Truths. Is that it by Cardinal Burke? Declaration of Truths.
Declaration of Truths. Yeah.
And what we're
Burke
saying,
and Schneider, yeah.
Yeah. And so what we're going to do is try to get a document like that, maybe combine a couple of those documents put out by Cardinal Burke. And we're going to go around and we're going to ask all of the bishops of the world, impose this in your diocese under pain of anathema. We're going to approach the Pope. We're going to be actually like taking the fight to the leftists. Now, a lot of the doomers out there, again, are going to say, well, there's no point. Everything's bought into it, et cetera, et cetera. Even if just one bishop does it, that's at least a step in the right direction. Point is that a lot of trad influencers, they sit back and they talk about what's wrong and they never actually practically get involved with their viewers and they say, let's go out and do something. Because again, we're already defeated mentally about it. And so, yeah, I guess the solution to all of this is just, right, go out and do stuff, make high quality content, go and reach Gen Z, go into the spaces where they're at. Don't talk about things that they're not going to be interested in, like, you know, customs from the 7th century that you can integrate into Lent because they're going to be like, that doesn't help me get a job. That doesn't help me get married. You know, actually go out and talk about these substantive issues, but then bring along the actual theological strain of traditionalism and say, you know, guys, I like that you like the pretty liturgy, but it's a little bit deeper than that. Do you have 60 seconds? Let me tell you why. So that's kind of my rant, but I know that at least Anthony Abate agrees with me and Murray Rundis agrees with me.
Thank you. I think that was very interesting, and we need to consider a younger person's perspective. So. Father, do you have any words of wisdom for us before we start wrapping things up? I do have one more thing for us to discuss. We'll end on kind of a humorous note. Cardinal Supich can always be counted on to give us some material to roast, so we have something in that regard. But Father, do you have any thoughts about what Nick said?
Isn't he a delight? Isn't he a delight? Just a delight. Always, you can be counted on. He can be counted on. No, just one word. I remember at NYU studying psychology. We had to write a paper on adolescent psychology, and I got a hold of Frank Sullivan. Lo and behold, Frank Sullivan was a Jesuit priest. I didn't know that. He's like the authority on adolescence. And I said, well, let's go. Adolescence, when does it begin and when does it end? He said, I'd say about 12. And are we talking about the United States, affluent United States? I said, yes. He said, about 40 to 45. I said, adolescence. He said, yes, adolescence. I said, and he gave me all of the documentation for it. It's because affluence arrests development, right? That's the deal. I think traditionally, we've always taken the adolescents as they're going to rebel, they're not going to go to mass, they're not. This happens like forever, and almost in every culture. It's that getting away from home, the individualization process, the confusion that you have to live for some years, and they come back. I think that we've always taken that approach. I have. I remember telling many parents, well, just keep your boy or your girl in prayer, and we'll pray that they come to their senses, right? But I since it does go to 40 or 45, we should take a different approach to the whole matter. And what you're saying, Nicholas, makes a lot of sense. If that's the way to hit them, to approach them, to get their attention, yeah, I like that. We can't.
So
what
Nick,
I'm trying to say is we can't do what I've been.
Nick, are you volunteering to teach all of us how to use these newfangled apps that you're talking about?
That would be good.
No, absolutely. Like the thing that inspired me about this was just this real quick. When you guys who all have YouTube channels, go and look at your own demographics and tell me how old they are. the vast majority of trad channels that I've gotten to know and talk about, the demographics are usually 50 and older. And the reason they're 50 and older is that there were a lot of people over the last 13 years. Let's be honest, guys. A lot of our channels grew under the Pope Francis pontificate because it was older individuals who liked John Paul II, who liked Benedict, who got scandalized under Francis and came over here. Whereas the rest of Gen Z was like, I've never even heard of Pachamama. I've never even heard of any of these stuff. It's because we were only speaking to older people.
All right. So as promised, we'll end on a humorous note, courtesy of Cardinal Blaise Cupich. We hope he's going into a retirement sometime soon. But he released an article last week, I guess middle of the week, very, very ironically on the traditional feast of St. Pius X, I will add, September 3rd. And this is what he had to say. So this article or this column for the Chicago Diocesan newspaper is called Tradition versus Traditionalism. He's very selectively quoting St. Vincent of Lerins regarding doctrinal development. That's another big topic because Pope Leo has announced that he's going to name, St. John Henry Newman, a doctor of the church. And I think a lot of modernist progressives are kind of salivating at that prospect of being able to misappropriate him for their ends, which is kind of what Cardinal Cupich does in this article. But he says, I am convinced that the bishops approached the reform of the liturgy back in the 60s as an exercise in taking responsibility for the correct development of church teaching as manifest in the way we worship. In many ways, he says, the reform was a recovery of truths of the faith, which over time were obscured by a series of adaptations and influences that reflected the church's expanding relationship with secular power and society. He makes reference to the Carolingian era, which Dr. Kwasniewski has already skewered in a past article. But he says here, what is at stake in accepting the liturgical reforms of the council, which, again, he's doing what Pope Francis does, equating the Novus Ordo with Vatican II, is our very understanding of what it means to be a church of tradition. And there's so many things we could say in response to this. My response was to post footage of that bubble mass that he allowed in his, that took place in his diocese a few years ago with this grown man talking about late adolescence father. That this man was probably in his 60s, literally playing with a bubble wand in church during Holy Mass. Unbelievable. So it's laughable to hear Cardinal Cupich talk about, paying lip service to being a church of tradition when he allows that kind of outrageous behavior. But I thought Dr. Kwasniewski in particular, our liturgical expert, would have some choice words in response to this nonsense.
I find it most amusing that his criticism is that the secular world entered too much into the liturgy. That's his criticism of the pre-conciliar, right? I mean, that's just a sort of mic drop moment. Like, are you not aware of what secular means? How secular things can find their way into the liturgy and into the church. I don't know. I think Cardinal Cupich's newspaper columns they're kind of fun to read because it's like the most brain dead superficial account that can possibly be given of any topic. Is you just find it in his newspaper columns. There's no sophistication. There doesn't even seem to be a sense of irony or self-awareness. I don't know, does he really? I find it baffling, honestly. While I've got the floor for a second, I did want to mention to folks this book. And yes, Nick, by the way, I'm going to just keep writing books, okay? Because I think that it's important to write books and to educate people who want to read, because ultimately this makes a difference too. And I hope that you'll take this and make it into Instagram Reels. But anyway, this is a book that I edited called 60 Years After Catholic Writers Assess the Legacy of Vatican II. And I wanted to mention, this is a very nice collection. It's got Timothy Flanders in it, speaking about Vatican II as a post-war council. It's got Philip Campbell is in here. And I've got a piece in here. It's an interesting collection because it's got different perspectives, including George Weigel, Ross Douthat, Gregory DePippo, Larry Chapp, all sorts of perspectives in here. So if you want to get the sort of lie of the land of, all the different views on the council, this is a helpful book. Mm-hmm. Including the traditionalist point of view, of course.
Nice. Anybody else have any thoughts about Cardinal Cupich's words? Go ahead.
Yeah,
Philip.
I do. Well, he says that the obscuring of the liturgy goes back to the Carolingian era, and that Vatican II is a recovery of these ancient, like the Carolingians came to power in 751. So if he thinks that the church's truth has been obscured for 1214 years, then why should I have any credence in an adjustment made in 1969? Like it's kind of like the old Protestant argument. Like if Luther says that the Catholic Church can be wrong, by what rationale can I have confidence that Luther is right? It doesn't make any sense.
Anthony Stein.
Fortunately, Cardinal Kupich was born in time to take care of all of this. He was born just in time. Yeah.
Philip made a reference to this. I've heard Protestants refer to it as the Babylonian captivity, where essentially the true church may have been the Catholic Church, or it might not have been. It depends on which one you're talking to. But the true Church of Christ had to go underground because Constantine and his Jesuit henchmen took the church over in the 4th century and buried Catholicism forever and ever and ever. Right. And they were so lucky that Martin Luther came along. Jesus was so lucky that Martin Luther came along to save his church, and that morally upstanding man, Henry VIII, came along with them to save the church. And then that's the same argument Supich is making. It's that Jesus was so lucky to have Bugnini and men like him save the church and liberate us from the Babylonian captivity of rigid clericalism.
And now Supich.
Put this one on here. Thank you, Drew. I appreciate that nice comment of yours.
Let me quote Kennedy Hall's comment here. So Kennedy Hall says this: Cardinal Supich says the church has erred for centuries when it comes to liturgy, and then expects Catholics to accept the Novus Ordo because it is from the church.
Boom.
Anyway.
There we go.
So true. My comment on Supich's comments is that it's fake and gay. That's it.
Yes.
Yes. He would have been perfectly at home on Saturday.
Touche.
Yes. All right, guys. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. We've gone for a little over an hour and 20 minutes. It seems like time has really flown by. We have, if you can believe it, we have almost 1,300 people watching live right now. So I think this is a sign that people are very interested in us coming together and having these conversations and just seeing us kind of joke around. And like Nick was talking about, we don't need to be serious all the time. I mean, we are talking about something very serious for sure, but we do have to have some humor involved and show people that we're just, regular guys who love our Lord, love the church, and want to do something about the crisis in the church. So thank you all for spending a little bit of your time with me this morning. If anybody else has anything they wanted to promote, like a book or a podcast or anything else, Father, I purchased Father's novel, and what's the title?
Yeah,
And
please read Murr's books. Yes.
Yes. I want to start getting around to reading.
And it was night.
Yeah. And it was night. Yes. There's the Godmother, also Murder in the.
Oh, the Godmother. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. We were talking to Anthony.
I just had a priest contact me. I just had a priest contact me to say that the Gagnon investigation of the Roman Curia never took place.
Wow.
I said, What are you saying? It never did? I'm telling you it did. He said, no, it didn't. We know it didn't. I said, good, very good. Anyway, there's a book written about what did take place. God help us.
Oh, one other thing. I got a question in the live chat that I wanted to put up. If anybody has any suggestions, what documents, pronouncements of the council should we as a community take issue with? What resources on this would you suggest? You guys have any suggestions on that? One thing that comes to my mind, this little booklet from Angelus Press is actually pretty helpful. It's a conference that Father Schmidtberger gave many years ago, but it's called Time Bombs in the Second Vatican Council. It's kind of a summary of some of the problematic texts, but it's very small. It's just basically a little pamphlet. So it's an easy read. Anybody else have any suggestions in that regard?
Yeah, definitely. My favorite book really on about a dozen different topics is Bishop Schneider's book Christus Vincit.
Yes.
It's interesting, if you go onto Amazon, it has something like 1,300 5-star reviews. I mean, it's been a real blockbuster.
Yes.
But he has a really wonderful discussion of the council. It's very balanced. He says most of the documents, most of what's said is orthodox, which is true, or at least a patient of an orthodox reading. But then he draws attention to some really problematic passages, including probably his favorite example is the statement in Nostra Aetate number 3, that Muslims adore the same God as the Christians do. Mm-hmm. And he goes into the fact that this is not true, because adoration for Christians is a supernatural act. It's something that we do by divine grace. We adore the Holy Trinity, and the Muslim does not do that. He worships God with a kind of philosophical or metaphysical act that is merely created, is not salvific, is not divine. So the adoration there it's an equivocation. It's a pure equivocation. And he says this is very dangerous, this kind of equivocation. So that's it. Christus Vincit is what I would recommend.
Very good.
That's a good book. A good work that I would reference for the crisis to be solved is St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae. That's where I'll end.
I mentioned before De Matte's book, which I did not say the correct title. It's actually called Vatican II: An Unwritten Story.
Yes.
That one's very eye-opening on zooming in on a lot of the specific phraseology and whatnot that proved to be so controversial and problematic.
Yes. All right. Well, I think that brings us to a close. Unless anyone else has anything they want to add before we close up here. Thank you all again for joining. We have close to 1,350 people watching us at this point. So thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you to Timothy Flanders and 1 Peter 5 and I think also Kennedy Hall for brainstorming this idea last year. And hopefully we can keep it going with bringing on new faces. And so I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week. Blessed feast of Our Lady's Nativity to all of you today. And Father, maybe you could close us in prayer and give us a blessing, and to all those who are watching live, if you would.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for these encounters. We give you thanks for sharing, or letting us share, your wisdom on a lot of issues, some of them 60 years old. We give you thanks for enkindling new interest in new viewers, in new Catholics on these issues. And we ask you for a solution to all of the problems we've discussed. We pray this through the intercession of the Blessed Mother of God and our own Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners,
now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thank you all so much. Again, my channel is Veritatis Vox, and I based that on the words of our Lord to Pontius Pilate on Good Friday, when he told him that, "For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to give testimony to the truth, and those who are of the truth hear my voice." So may we be always men and women who hear the voice of the Lord, who are people of the truth, and if we hear his voice, may we not harden our hearts, but be open to his grace and his wisdom. Until next time, God bless you all, and Godspeed. Thank you.